So today we're going to learn how to use the Pathfinder tool in Illustrator. So if you open up your folder and double click on the Pathfinder practice file, you'll see that this file contains some somewhat simple logos for you to practice some of these new skills with. And the first page where you can just practice using some of these tools before you actually try and trace any logos. Before we start, let's go to the Window menu, Workspace, and make sure that Essentials is selected. If Essentials is selected, then select Reset Essentials to make sure that you're seeing the palettes and the tools in the same places that you're going to see them in this video. Before we start looking at the Pathfinder palette, the first thing I want to do is talk to you about a special kind of shape. And it's a shape that's composed of more than one path. And you've seen examples of this shape probably millions of times in your lives already. Whenever you're using a typeface and you're typing the letter O or the number 0 or any character that has an interior space that you can see through, you're seeing an example of a compound path. Fonts are by definition vector-based objects, which is why you can have one typeface installed and use it very small and very large and the quality doesn't diminish. So we're going to create our own compound path. And since I've referenced the letter O and the number 0, we're going to create our own letter O. The first thing we'll do is we'll select our ellipse tool, and we'll just use ordinary circles. And you're going to hold my Shift key, click and drag to make a circle. I want to make sure that I don't have a white fill in that circle. So I'm going to use the bottom portion of my palette to make sure that my little fill color chip is on top and ask for no fill. I want to make sure that I do have a stroke applied and black is nice and visible, and that should be the default. Now I'm going to create a second circle. And I'm just going to eyeball it so that it's roughly aligned vertically and horizontally with that first circle I created. So right now I have two paths, but they're not connected to one another. And my goal is to create a shape where this area will be filled, but this area will be empty. To do that, I need to select both of these shapes. So I'm going to select one, hold my Shift key, and click on the other. Then I need to use a special function to combine these two paths into a single shape. I go to Object, Compound Path, and select Make. And initially it doesn't look like anything's different, but watch what happens when we click on this shape that we've created, and notice that it doesn't matter where I click because now it's one single entity. And if I go to my Swatches palette, so I'm going to click on Window, select Swatches, make sure my fill icon is on the top. Notice that it's the area between these two paths that get filled and the center is empty. And just to prove that it really is empty or see-through in the middle part, I'm just going to click and drag and move this over, and you can see right through that middle section. So that's how you create a compound path. And of course, the shapes that you combine together in this way don't have to be two circles. One could be a circle, a square, a star shape, or any other configuration. Now that we know how to create a compound path, I'm going to delete that example and create two new shapes. One is going to be a rectangle, and I'm going to remove the fill by clicking on the No Fill button. And the next shape I create will be a polygon. I'm going to click and drag. It really doesn't matter how big or how small it is. And then I'm going to position these two objects so they overlap. When you use the Pathfinder, the two shapes that you want to manipulate should be overlapping in some way. And the shapes that you're using and where they overlap, that really depends on what sort of more complex shape you're trying to create. Now that I have two shapes, I'm going to get rid of the Swatches palette. I'm just going to dismiss it by clicking on the Close box. And we're going to go to the Window menu and select Pathfinder. And you'll notice that each of these little icons show two shapes that are overlapping. So that's a reminder that to use the Pathfinder, typically we're using two shapes that overlap in some way. So I'm going to select my square and hold Shift and select the other shape, so both shapes are selected. And the first option we're going to try is Unite. And these are actually little buttons, so I can hover over and see the name, but when I click, that actually executes that function. And you'll notice that the Unite function unites two different shapes into one shape. I'm going to press Command Z to undo, and both of those shapes are still selected. And now I'm going to move on to minus front. Now minus front, it's important to pay attention to the name. And since I created this shape after I created the square, I know that this shape is on top. But if ever I need to rearrange things, I can go to Object, Arrange, and just make sure it's at the very top or in front by selecting Bring to Front. So I'm going to have my square selected. I'm going to have this other shape selected, and then I'm going to click the minus front button. And you'll notice that what that does is it takes that front object and it almost treats it like a cookie cutter. So it just punches out that shape from the shape underneath. I'm going to Command Z to undo that. Next button is Intersect. And if I click this button, you'll notice that what it did is it got rid of all the rest of the shapes except for those areas where they overlapped or intersected. Command Z to undo. So now that we have a little introduction to a compound path and some of the shape modes in our Pathfinder palette, it's time to apply them to our logos. First, I'm going to make sure that my selection tool is the active tool and that nothing is selected in my document. And then I'm going to hold down my space bar, and you'll notice that the arrow changes to that little grabber hand, and we had this in Photoshop as well, which means I can simply click and drag and move over to our first artboard that has a logo for us to trace on it. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to take a look at this, and we're going to start off by building a compound path. So we're going to select our ellipse tool, we're going to hold our Shift key and click and drag, and if you want to reposition the shape as you're creating it, keep your mouse held down, keep your Shift key held down, and then hold down your space bar. And we had the same trick that we used in Photoshop as well. So I can keep my space bar held down, and when I move the mouse I can reposition the shape, and then if I let go of the space bar I can continue to click and drag till it's the right size. And then I let go of my mouse first, and then I let go of my Shift key. I'm going to create a second circle using the same technique. I'm going to hold my space bar down, reposition the edge of my circle, let go of my space bar, and then continue to drag to create that second circle. And then we're going to select our selection tool, click on our first inside circle, hold our Shift key, click on the outside circle, and then we're going to go to Object, Compound Path, Make. And notice there's a key command for this, and if you find yourself using this option a lot, then memorizing Command 8 is worth the time. So I'm going to click Make. I'm going to make sure that it really is a compound path, and probably the easiest way to do that is to bring up my swatches palette and make sure that my fill icon is on top and just click a color. And what I should see is this configuration only filling in between those two lines and the center remains transparent. I'm going to get rid of the fill for now. The next thing we want to do is we want to create two separate shapes from this compound path. To do that, we're going to select our rectangle tool. I'm going to click and drag and create a rectangle, and as I'm creating it, I'm going to make sure it's quite wide, and I'm trying to make sure that the height of it is about the same as the space that I want to create between these two sections of this logo. Once I have my rectangle created, I'm going to select my selection tool, and I'm going to move the cursor close to one of the corners of the rectangle and then click and drag. And I'm going to click and drag so that this is angled as close to this angle as possible. And once I have the angle right, I'm going to click somewhere on the path that's not a handle and align it with one of the edges. And if it's a little too shallow, then I'm simply going to click on one of the middle handles and make it a little deeper. So this rectangle should match up with that break in the logo, and it should also overlap that shape and in fact extend beyond it on this side and this side. Our next step is to make sure all our pieces are selected, so I'm going to click on my compound path. I'm going to hold my Shift key and click somewhere on the rectangle to make sure that's selected. Now remember that the rectangle was the last shape we created, so therefore we know it's on top or in front of our compound path. I'm going to click on my minus front button, and there it is. And now that compound path is separated into two separate shapes. You'll notice that when I select one of the halves of the logo, that everything becomes selected, but they actually are two separate shapes. If I go to my object menu, I notice I have an ungroup option, which means that as a result of that path operation, Illustrator went ahead and grouped those two things together. So I could very easily ungroup them, click off to the side, and select each one individually if I wanted to. To finish off this logo, all we need is a circle. So I'm going to select my ellipse tool, hold my Shift key, click and drag, use my space bar to reposition if necessary, release my mouse first, then release my Shift key, select my selection tool, click off to the side. Done. The second logo is the Beats logo, and if you take a look at it and the logo we just created together, you would follow a nearly identical process to create the Beats logo. The only real difference would be that rectangle that we used to create this empty area would not go all the way from one edge of the logo to the other. It would start outside of the edge of the circle and go just deep enough to connect with this inside edge. So I'm going to let you do that one on your own. The Emily Carr logo is quite a bit different from the two other logos. So we're going to do this one together. And the first thing we want to do is we want to create this C shape. So we're going to select our ellipse tool. We're going to hold our Shift key, click and drag. Use your space bar if you need to reposition as you're creating a circle. Let go of your mouse first, then let go of your Shift key. Then we're going to create our second circular shape, holding my Shift key, clicking and dragging, holding down on the space bar when I want to position, letting go of the space bar when I want to continue dragging to change the size of the circle. I let go of my mouse first, then my Shift key. I'm going to reselect my selection tool, and we're going to create a compound path. So I'm going to select my inside circle, I'm going to select my outside circle, and go to Object, Compound Path Make. I'm going to make sure it's a compound path by making sure that my fill option is on top in my swatches palette, and just clicking to fill it in with a color to make sure that the center area is transparent. I'm going to remove the fill color and click off to the side. The next thing I want to do is I want to get rid of these lines here so that this C shape can be filled in. To do that, I'm going to use my rectangle tool, and I'm going to create a rectangle so that the side of the rectangle and the bottom of the rectangle line up with where the color ends. Also notice that I'm making sure that I'm not placing it right on the line. I'm going to make sure that it just moves past those outside edges of that circle. And now I'm going to select my compound path. I'm going to select my rectangle and use my Pathfinder minus front option. And now we're going to use a new tool, the knife tool. And I'm going to use the knife tool to cut this circular shape right here to create a separate shape to hold the yellow color. In our toolbox, the knife tool shares a spot with the eraser tool and the scissors tool. We're going to select the knife tool, and when you use the knife tool, you can click And by default, it just wants to follow whatever path you make with the knife. So you could use this knife tool and slice through a shape and create any sort of crazy configuration you want. But what we want is a nice straight line. So to cut with a straight line using the knife tool, we hold down our Option key, I click and I drag, and that little green line that you see shows me where my knife tool is going to cut. So I'm going to move over to my shape. I'm going to hold down my Option key, and I'm going to try and line up my cursor with this point that represents where I want to make that cut. So I'm going to hold my Option key, and I want to drag straight down. To help me drag in a straight line, perfectly vertical, I'm going to hold my Shift key. So I click and drag, and you'll notice that when I start to click and drag, I start clicking well past the edge that I want to cut, and I continue on all the way through and past the edge of the other side. Once I've made that cut, I'm going to reselect my selection tool, click off to the side, and now I have two separate shapes. Believe it or not, we're almost in the home stretch on this shape. When I take a look at the rest of the logo, I realize that all these interior shapes are the result of this first shape here being duplicated, and these other shapes result from the overlap. So I'm going to select that shape, I'm going to position my cursor over the path and hold my Option key, and I should see my cursor change to that double arrow, which means that if I click and drag, it will automatically duplicate that shape for me. I'm going to click off to the side, make sure the alignment is okay, use my nudge key if I need to reposition it, and you can see that our outlines match up perfectly with the logo. But what isn't perfect yet is that these are still just two shapes instead of all these separate shapes that we would need to add different colors. So we're going to use a new Pathfinder function that will allow us to do exactly that. I'm going to click on the first shape, our duplicate shape, and with those two shapes selected, we're going to use in the Pathfinders area a function called divide. And it's easier to see what it does than try and explain it. So I'm going to click on the divide button. I'm going to go to the object menu and ungroup. And now if I click and drag, you'll see exactly what the divide function did. Any area where there's overlap, it created separate objects. And because these are all separate objects, we can apply a different fill color to each one. You already know everything you need to know in order to create the Google logo. You would start with a compound path, you would add a rectangle, you would unite that rectangle with the compound path, and then you'd use your knife tool to cut that shape into separate sections so that each one could be filled with a unique color. So I'm going to let you do the Google logo on your own. The last logo is the Adidas logo. And you've created a leaf shape very similar to this in one of the previous tutorials, but we'll go through the first part of it together. Because this time, instead of using the Shape Builder tool, we're going to use the Pathfinder tool to do the same thing. So I'm going to select my ellipse tool, I'm going to hold my Shift key, and I'm going to draw a circle that matches the outline edge of that first center leaf shape. You actually have to draw a pretty darn big circle for it all to fit, using my space bar to reposition, always letting go of my mouse first, and then my Shift key. I know that the second half of this first leaf shape needs the same size of circle in order to line up with it, so I'm going to make sure that my selection tool is active. I'm going to click on my circle, make sure that my cursor is on top of the path, hold down my Option key so I see that arrow doubling up, and I'm going to click and drag a copy away and line it up with the other side of that leaf. Now I'm going to select both circles, and I'm going to use the intersect option. And now that I've created that leaf shape once, I'm not going to do it from scratch for both of the others. I'm going to select that first leaf shape, position my cursor somewhere over the path, hold down my Option key so I see the arrow doubling up, and drag away a copy. I'm going to position my mouse somewhere close but outside of one of the corner handles, and I can rotate that leaf until it's the correct angle. And right now it's really close to the correct angle, but one thing I didn't notice before, these two other leaf shapes are actually smaller than that first one. So I'm just going to hold my Shift key and click and drag and scale it down and reposition and adjust my rotation as much as I need. And that's pretty close. I'm going to click on that second leaf shape, position my cursor over the path, hold down my Option key, and click and drag away a copy. And rather than rotating this, I'm going to use a different function which will actually be faster. If I select my rotation tool here in the tool palette and click and hold, we have something called the Reflect tool. And when I use the Reflect tool, usually what I do is I select it and then I double click on it. And a little dialog box opens up, and we can select how we want this object to reflect along a horizontal or vertical axis. And in this case, I think we want the vertical axis, the angle, and notice that there's a preview button. So vertical reflection 90 degrees, and it's perfect. I click OK. I reselect my selection tool, and I click off to the side. And now what we're going to do is we're going to select all three of these leaf shapes, and we're going to create one shape out of these. Select each of the three leaf shapes by clicking on first one, then holding Shift and clicking on the other two. Then we're going to unite these shapes together so they're a single shape. I'm going to click on my Unite button here in my Shape Modes area of the Pathfinder. And our last step is to create this cutout area, the iconic 3 Adidas stripes. So we're going to select our rectangle tool. I'm going to create a rectangle to represent that first stripe, and I'm going to make sure that that rectangle begins and ends well outside of that leaf shape. I'm going to select my selection tool and just use my nudge key to move it into position, and of course you can change the width or the depth of that rectangle. I'm going to select the rectangle, hold my Option key as my cursor is hovering over one of the paths, and click and drag to duplicate it. And I'm going to do the same thing one more time. And now I have my 3 stripes. Because we created these 3 rectangles after we created the leaf shapes, it's important to remember that these 3 rectangles are on top or in front of that leaf configuration. I'm going to click and drag around all the elements of this logo so everything is selected. And then I'm going to use my Pathfinder to complete this logo. The option I want is minus front, and we're done.